have a few parents of atrium-aged children here, so you can tell me if these words ring any bells to you. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Anybody back there in the parent section? This is the simple prophecy, these words of the prophet Isaiah. I should have asked up here in the front. Okay. These words of the prophet Isaiah are the prophecy with which we begin the children, the littlest ones in Atrium, the ones who can't even quite read yet, to think about God's presence with us. We tell them, a prophet is somebody who hears God's words, who comes so close to God, and God comes so close to them that they're able to offer God's words to the people. And these are the words that the prophet Isaiah said, and we write them on a card for those who are just able to read, can start to read some of these words. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Now, if this is ringing any bells from my Christmas sermon or from Advent, you're on the right track, because we hear these words. This is an Advent prophecy. We hear these words during the season of Advent. We usually read a longer version of this reading at the Christmas Eve services, and there's a reason for that. But the image of light and darkness goes way beyond Christmas. In fact, the most ancient way that we enact light and darkness is at the Easter Vigil. And this is a little bit of a plug and a little bit of a spoiler alert. It's a really special ancient service that we revived here in the Napa Valley just in the last few years. We're sharing it with St. Mary's, going back and forth. So this year it'll be at St. Mary's in Napa. And you always have to check, what time sundown is on that Saturday before Easter, because it changes, Easter moves around. And it has to be dark. You have to gather when it's at least starting to get dark. And you light a new fire, and you light the Christ candle, the Paschal candle from that new fire, and bring it into a dark church. That's the first movement of this service. And then we begin to share that light with one another. We pass little candles around like we do on Christmas Eve, and the church begins to glow. But this is the big spoiler alert. I'm really sorry to ruin this for you if you haven't been to that service yet. But halfway through the service, at the Easter proclamation, as we proclaim the resurrection of Christ, we turn on all the lights and ring the bells really loud. It's still startling, even if you know it's coming. And what we're doing is tapping into an ancient part of ourselves as human beings. It's only been the last 100 or so years that we've been able to kind of summon light at our command, right? Think about what our ancestors had to do to get light in the darkness of the nighttime or in the dark seasons of the year. They had to procure oil. They had to make candles. They had to make sure that they had fuel for their fire, right? Having light was a major concern because the darkness was complete. It was encompassing. It was enveloping. There's really no way for us to experience that as modern day humans. If we go out in the backcountry, we've got our little weird headlamps and flashlights and lights on our phones and things that we can sort of turn on at the drop of a hat. But it's in us because it's part of what humans have always experienced, right? Light and darkness. And so the smallest children understand that as well, right? The people who sat in a land of deep darkness, the people who dwelt in the shadow of death, to them light has come. Now, the prophet Isaiah meant one thing when he said those words in his time and his context, but because he's a prophet, his words echo, right? They have more than one layer of truth, and they echo through the centuries, and they echo to the time of Jesus, and they echo past the time of Jesus, to the time that the gospel writer Matthew wrote these words down. And Matthew is the gospel writer of the prophets. He's always pulling back from the Old Testament and saying, see, here's how this is being fulfilled. And he's not doing it to prove anything. This is really important. Matthew is not proof texting Jesus. What Matthew is doing is drawing on the old, drawing the resonance of the ancient prophets' words, and showing people how they're coming true, maybe in ways that they never even expected. So when we talk to the children about the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, and we start to talk to them about Jesus, we say, Jesus, at after he was born and he grew up, he started to move around the country. And when people asked him, they were drawn to him. And they asked him, who are you? What can you say about yourself? One of the things that he said about himself was, I am the light. I am the light of the world. So when Matthew draws on Isaiah, talking about the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, the land of Galilee of the Gentiles, that northern part of the kingdom of Israel, again, in his time, that means one thing. In Jesus' time, we can see that light in a human body, walking around, moving around, that part of God's earth, and sharing that light with God's world. And one of the first things that he did when he was walking around was call some disciples, some buddies, right? Now, he's not kind of like forming a gang here, right? He's not just getting his posse together. He's not looking for some friends. He's doing something much, much more. He's beginning to establish what we have here. He's establishing a community. Because the path of life, walking in that light, right? Moving from walking in darkness to walking in light means walking together. It means being able to open our eyes and see who's walking with us. So Jesus calls some companions, some disciples. Has anybody seen the series The Chosen? Have you come across that? Oh my gosh, okay, everybody, go watch The Chosen. It's great. What's wonderful about it, it's a mini-series, or a, what do you call it? Like a what do you call that? Television show. Yeah, with multiple seasons, whatever that is. It's not about the life of Jesus, but it focuses on his disciples, and it gives them, what's wonderful about it, it gives them all backstories. So it's historical fiction, it's biblical fiction, but it's weaving stories for these people. So you see the first 4 episodes, you see, Peter and some of the other disciples, and how complex their lives were. They're a first century fishermen literally caught in the net of the Roman Empire, back on his taxes, family complications. If our lives are complicated, make yourself a poor fisherman in the first century, and their lives are probably complicated in some ways we can't even quite grasp. But they're real human lives. And that's what I love about it, because just reading this on the page, we've heard these stories since maybe Sunday school. Peter and James and John and Andrew, they get up and they follow Jesus, and we think, how great for them. Could I be like that? Could I be that kind of a disciple? But you put it in the context of their complicated lives, and it starts to mean something else. And it's an opportunity for us as we begin this new year, this church year, just like we reflected last week on our baptisms with the context of Jesus' baptism. We thought about our own belovedness. This week we get to think about our own following, our own response, our own discipleship. I like to look up words. I like to know what the root meaning of a word is, because it's often very surprising. And if you have a star word, if you've pulled one of these stars off of the wall, and I hope you do, to be kind of a guiding light for you this year, look up the word in the dictionary and get down to those, Greek or Latin or whatever they are roots. I looked up the root for the word disciple. It's connected to the word discipline. And a disciple is a follower, someone who learns, right? Who's a learner principally. But the root means to receive or accept. I thought it would be something about learning, but it's simple receiving. One of the commentators that I was listening to about the scripture this week mentioned something that I didn't know about the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's unique in that of all the Gospels, it's the one where most often the subject of any verb is God. God is the principal actor in this gospel. And you might say, well, it's Peter and James and John. They're the ones that immediately they get up and follow, and Andrew. But what happens first? Jesus calls them, right? Jesus calls them. Not kind of en masse, but you particularly, follow me. You, come follow me. And Jesus hears, the disciples hear that call, they accept it, they receive it, and then they do respond. The commentator that I was listening to said, it was a great comfort to him thinking about his vocation, because he works a lot with young people who are discerning their own vocations, what they're going to go be in the world, the mark that they're going to make on the world. It's a comfort to him, and he shares this with those young people, that as a pastor and a theologian, a big part of his work is listening, just waiting for God to tell him what to do. That be a big part of all of our work, maybe? Our daily life? Right? How often do we say, God, I don't really know what to do with this. I'm going to wait for instructions. I have a really clear memory of being at a mission congregation that was trying to get off the ground, refounded in Gonzales in my last diocese. There was no people in this church. There was a building. And my sister lived there in exchange for some mission work, and the whole diocese got together for a cleanup day because there were literally frogs hopping around in this church. My kids loved it. So we worked, we cleaned up the church. I remember the bishop kind of leaning the broom against the wall, standing back and saying, okay, God, your church is clean. Now what? Now what do you want us to do? And it struck me, because here's the bishop. If anybody's supposed to know what to do, it's her, right? I look up to her. She's my leader, a visionary. I follow her. She's just waiting for instructions. Right? She's waiting to receive that call from God, to accept it. It takes me back to the prophet Isaiah and his original context. The original context of that prophecy about light and darkness is conflict, it's war. Those northern territories of Zebulun, Naphtali, Galilee, they have been taken over. They've been conquered by, I think, the Persian Empire. One of you is going to check me who's in seminary. It's okay. They've been conquered, and the king in Jerusalem is wondering, what am I going to do? Who am I going to ally with? How am I going to save my skin here? Got any word for me, prophet? And the prophet says, don't worry about it. Those people who are sitting in the shadow of death and darkness up there in the northern, they're going to see a great light. The light's going to dawn on them, right? The light of freedom and justice and healing and truth is coming. So just keep your eggs in this God basket. It's going to be okay. It's a pretty hard thing to do. And it's not always the word for every situation, right? We have to discern that and sort that out. But the first thing that we have to do is to receive, to accept the situation as it is, and to accept that God is God and we're not. That's the place where it all starts. And then discernment starts to happen. Another word that starts with D-I-S-C. And guess what? It doesn't have to do with this. It's a different word. Right? So discernment, that root, is about sorting out. So we accept, we receive, and then we can kind of sort out and listen and respond. Now, today's the day that we are kicking off our annual stewardship season, the time of year that we think about our commitments to the church and if we're called, how we're called to give financially in the coming year. We've moved that from the fall, if you'll remember, to this first part of the new year. And as I think about stewardship, which we just define as the way that we care for all that God's entrusted to us, I can't disconnect stewardship and discipleship. They really are the same thing. Because if you think about all that we've received from God and accepting that gift as coming from God, then what are we to do but to give, right? How else can we respond to God's generosity except by being generous ourselves? I was talking to Vince about this. We have tithed, which means giving 10% of our income since I began my ministry in this country in 2009. And it's just always been obvious to us. It hasn't always been easy, but it's been very clear that this biblical standard of giving was the standard that we felt called to. and we've simply responded to that. And sometimes our accountant says, "Are you crazy? You make this much and you give away this much?" But it's where we start. And we were talking this morning, and I realized the reason for that. Why that's always been so obvious, and almost so obvious to me that it's hard for me to explain. And it goes back to the first year of our marriage. We moved to El Salvador and served the church there. I went off and got a Fulbright grant from the U.S. government and went to El Salvador and served the church there, and somehow that was okay with them for a year, and then felt called to stay there. And I had come to the end of my own resources. I had come to the end of what I could do on my own. So I wrote an email to about 400 people that were, everybody I could think of. They were relatives, friends, neighbors, classmates, professors, people connected to Companion Diocese of El Salvador. And I said, hey, we feel called to stay here, but we don't have any money. And if we're going to stay as missionaries, we need some money. And $20,000 showed up. And then I did it the next year, and it happened again, and that was the amount of money that we needed to live in El Salvador. So I learned really early on that our living, what we had, didn't come from anything that I did, but it came from God's generosity expressed through others. And it's the same still. People might not know this, but our church doesn't receive any outside funding from anywhere. Everything that pays my salary, that keeps the lights on, that keeps the carpet clean, that we give away even, and this church gives away more than any church in our diocese. It all comes from the generosity of our members, right? Responding to God's generosity, saying, okay, God, I recognize everything that I have. I accept this gift from you. And I'm going to give back. This is what I'm called to give back. So as we move through these 4 weeks of our annual commitment season, there's going to be a lot of different ways you can do that. You can do it online. There's a card in the pew in front of you. You can email Diana Dean, the financial manager. You can just go online and make sure your ongoing a commitment on if you pay through the website is set up. That's a great way to make that commitment. But one thing that I'm going to invite all of us to do for these 4 weeks is to put something in the plate each week. We'll kind of admit that passing the plate has always been an awkward moment in churches, but since the pandemic, it got even more awkward because we kind of forgot how to do it, and then like half of us started giving online, so the plate comes, and you're like, well, I already gave, and what do I do? So here's what we're going to do. There are little pieces of scratch paper in the pew in front of you. And I invite you each week for the next 4 weeks to grab one of those out, just write something down on it. Whatever it is that you want to give to God, to offer to God, to give thanks to God for this week, anything. Nobody else is going to look at it. We're going to fold them up and put them in an envelope and burn them in that new fire at the Easter Vigil, right? They're going straight to God. If you write on a pledge card that's in that pew in front of you, someone will look at that and put that into the system. But the little scratch paper, that's for you and God. And if you're joining us online, you need to do this too. So you got 2 ways to do it. You can be public and put it in the chat, or you can write it on a little piece of paper at home and put that in a place that's holy for you. Your home altar, a little bowl, a little cup, bury it in the ground, let it compost and go back to the earth, whatever works. Or bring it to church next Sunday. So I'm going to give us a couple of minutes to do this, because otherwise I know you're going to be writing through the prayers and not listening to the announcements and stuff like that. So we've got like 2 minutes. There's pens, there's papers. Write down something. You can fill out your annual commitment card if you'd like to do that instead or as well. And then when that plate comes by, we're going to have something to offer back to God.